Every evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and gold, Clara could be found at the edge of the world. The old coastal pier was her sanctuary and her prison. The sun cast long skeletal shadows across the harbor as the tide groaned against the rotting pilings. She sat there with a stillness that rivaled the ancient rocks, her eyes fixed on the point where the gray Atlantic met the sky. Rain would drench her thin shoals, and the winter winds would bite at her skin, but Clara never wavered. To the villagers, she was a living ghost, a tragic fixture of the shoreline. But to Clara, the pier was the only place where the air still tasted of hope. She was waiting for Elias, a man who had vanished into the blue expanse years ago. Her mind often drifted back to that final morning. The air had been crisp, carrying the scent of pine and brine. Elias had held her hands, his palms rough from ropes and toil, but his touch was incredibly gentle. He was a merchant sailor, driven by a desperate need to clear the mountain of debt his father had left behind. "I will be back before the first frost," he had whispered into her hair, a certainty she clung to like a life raft. That promise was her anchor. He was embarking on a high-stakes merchant voyage, a gamble for a future free from poverty. They had shared a final cup of warm tea, the steam rising between them, a silent pact of a beautiful life yet to be lived together. When the ship finally pulled away from the harbor, Clara watched until it was a speck on the horizon. The first few weeks were filled with a restless excitement, counting days for letters that were supposed to come, but they never arrived. The salt air felt thicker then, heavy with the weight of unanswered questions. Instead, a suffocating silence settled, broken only by news of a violent storm that had torn through the merchant lanes. The ship was reported missing, swallowed by a sea that kept its secrets well. Other families donned black veils, but Clara felt a cold distance from their collective grief. When the village organized a somber memorial service, Clara was the only one who didn't attend. From her lonely spot on the pier, she heard the distant tolling of the church bell, a sound that felt like an insult to the man she knew was still out there. The villagers looked at her with pity, but she ignored their offers of comfort. She refused to mourn a man who hadn't truly left her heart. Her unwavering motivation was a profound belief that their connection was a tether, an invisible silver cord. If she stayed put, he would find his way back to her. She would be the unwavering lighthouse he didn't have during the dark, crashing storm. Years bled into one another, turning her youthful features into a map of endurance. One evening, after a particularly fierce tide had retreated, something caught the light among the pebbles at the base of the pier. It was a rusted tin box, its metal pitted by salt. Clara's heart hammered as she knelt in the wet sand, her fingers trembling with a mix of fear and hope. Inside lay a small silver compass, the one she had given Elias. But she noticed dark stains across the glass, and the underlying ledger tucked beneath it. It wasn't grime. It looked like old ink or dried blood. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. This discovery shattered the quiet stasis of Clara's long vigil, forcing her to realize the sea had finally decided to speak, though the truth was more terrifying than she had ever imagined. The compass pointed toward a dark secret that had been buried in the deep for far too long now. Clara's fingers brushed the rusted edges of the tin box as she hurried through the narrow cobblestone streets of the village, the weight of the object feeling heavier with every step. For the first time in over a decade, her gaze wasn't fixed on the distant horizon, but on the path directly ahead of her. She sought out the old maritime expert, a man whose skin was as weathered as the ancient charts lining his walls, and whose eyes, though clouded by age, still held the sharpness of a navigator. In the dim, amber light of his cramped study, surrounded by the scent of old parchment and tobacco, he pried the ledger from its resting place. His breath hitched as he began to decipher the cramped, salt-stained handwriting. The records did not tell a story of a simple tragedy at sea. They whispered of a cold, calculated betrayal. The ship hadn't been a victim of nature's fury alone. It had been systematically sabotaged. The ledger contained entries that pointed directly to the rival investor, a man who had since ascended to a position of immense power in the town. He had insured the cargo for a fortune and then ensured it would never reach its destination, effectively erasing the mountain of debt Elias's family owed while lining his own pockets with blood money. The revelation struck Clara like a physical blow, vibrating through her very marrow. The grief that had been her quiet companion for years began to ferment, transforming into a potent, concentrated rage. This wasn't the pure weight she had once believed in. It was a crime left unpunished. Tucked within the hidden lining of the ledger's leather binding, she discovered a series of unsent letters, written on scraps of yellowed paper. They were Elias's words, penned during the agonizing years he spent stranded on a remote, nameless island. He described the grueling labor of trying to construct a raft from driftwood and vines, his hands perpetually bleeding and his spirit fraying. Yet every letter ended with a promise to reach her. He wrote of the first frost, and how the memory of her face was the only thing keeping the madness of the isolation at bay. These letters were a testament to a man who had refused to die because he knew she was still standing on that pier, acting as his invisible lighthouse. As Clara began to ask quiet, pointed questions around the harbor, the atmosphere in the village shifted. The rival investor, now a pillar of the local community with influence that reached into every shipping house, noticed the deviation from her usual silent vigil. He began to appear in her periphery, a dark looming figure in fine wool coats. One evening, he cornered her near the old docks, his voice a silk-wrapped threat that smelled of expensive brandy. He suggested that an aging woman should be careful not to trip into the very sea she loved so much, warning her that some secrets were better left at the bottom of the Atlantic. He tried to intimidate her into silence, but he underestimated the resilience of a woman who had already spent a lifetime in the cold. Clara found unexpected strength in the widows of the sea. These were women who had lived in the shadows of the village, each nursing their own quiet tragedies. When they saw the fire in Clara's eyes, they emerged from their mourning. They brought her old cargo manifests, shared whispered rumors of suspicious accidents involving the investors' ships, and provided a protective circle around her. They were no longer just victims of the waves, they were a sisterhood of justice. Together, they began to piece together a conspiracy of corporate greed and murder that had defined the town's economy for decades. The tension in the village was a coiled spring, ready to snap, when a bedraggled traveler arrived at the local inn. He was a man of the world, his face etched with the sun of a dozen different climates. Over a tankard of ale, he spoke of a man he had encountered in a bustling, nameless port only 6 months ago. The man lived in the shadows of the harbor, working as a shipbreaker, his face scarred and his eyes filled with a haunting weariness. He matched Elias's description to the last detail, but the traveler's voice dropped to a whisper as he delivered the final crushing blow. The man didn't want to be found. He had told the traveler that some ghosts are better left in the past, and that his return would only bring ruin to those he had left behind. Clara stood at the edge of the tavern, the world spinning, realizing the man she loved was alive, but he was hiding from a truth more dangerous than the ocean itself. Clara turned her back on the old coastal pier for the first time in 2 decades. The wood groaned behind her, a sound like a phantom's weary sigh. She did not look back as the salt spray hit the stones one last time, for she was no longer a statue of grief. She was a woman of motion. The journey across the churning Atlantic was long, but her heart beat with a steady rhythm of resolve. She eventually arrived at the distant, nameless port where the air smelled of exotic spices and rotting timber. It was a labyrinth of shadows, a place where people went when they wanted the world to forget their names. She wandered the sprawling docks for days, showing the silver compass to sailors with sun-blackened skin. They whispered of a man known as the Ghost of the Pier, a recluse living in the hollowed-out hull of a derelict ship. He was a shadow among shadows, a man who worked in the dark because his eyes could no longer bear the glare of the sun. Clara felt the invisible silver cord pulling tighter, the tether humming with an agonizing proximity that made her breath hitch. She found him in the bowels of a rusted vessel. The air was thick with the scent of damp wool and old sea salt. When the light of her lantern fell upon him, she did not see the vibrant young sailor from her memory. Instead, she saw a man whose face was a map of scars, his eyes clouded with a milky film from years of relentless tropical sun and trauma. Elias did not look at her, but he froze when he caught the faint scent of the lavender soap she had used since her youth. He whispered her name, and the sound was like dry leaves skittering across a grave. "You should never have come, Clara," he rasped, his hands trembling. He explained the bitter truth. The rival investor had not just sabotaged the ship, he had sent assassins to ensure no survivors could ever testify. Elias had survived, but he knew that if he returned, the investor would kill Clara to keep him silent. His absence was his only shield, a wall he built just to keep her breathing. He had lived as a ghost, so she could live as a woman. Every lonely day spent in this foreign port was an act of agonizing protection. He had loved her enough to let her believe he was dead. The reunion was shattered by the thud of boots on the deck above. The rival investor had followed the trail of Clara's departure. He stepped into the hold, a pistol in his hand, his face twisted in a sneer of cold triumph. He believed he could bury his crimes here, thousands of miles from the village. But he had underestimated the power of the Widows of the Sea and the ledger Clara had entrusted to them. Even as the investor aimed his weapon, local harbor authorities swarmed the ship, led by officials who had received the documented evidence of the sabotage and the unsent letters. The paper trail Clara had uncovered, supported by the testimony of the village women, was an inescapable net. The rival investor was led away in irons, his legacy of corruption collapsing into the shadows. Clara and Elias did not return to the village. There were too many ghosts there, too much heavy silence. Instead, they found a small cottage on a different coast, where the earth was warm and the frost never came. On the day they settled in, Clara led the blind man to the water's edge. They sat together, hands entwined, watching a sunset that did not demand a promise. Back in the village, the old pier stood empty, a monument to a vigil that had finally reached its end. The sea had taken much, but it had given back the only thing that mattered, the freedom to stop waiting and start living together.